Sociology Robot. Hello and welcome to the 9th video lecture on OCR A Level Sociology Paper 1, looking at socialization. Socialization is an important but simple concept in sociology. It is the process of influencing people so that they join society and share its norms and values. That's simple, but socialization can be explicit or implicit. Explicit socialization takes place when somebody knows exactly what they're doing. They are influencing another person to change, grow up, behave in a way that society expects. Parents might do this when they're disciplining a child. Implicit socialization is the stuff that people aren't consciously aware of. When a father takes his son to a football match, he's probably doing so because he enjoys it, but he is also training his son to take his place in society and share his norms and values. Now, the thing about socialization is that we internalize it. We take it into ourselves, it becomes part of our personality, and we forget that we were ever taught it. It often feels to us as though we've always liked these things and done things this way. Primary socialization is socialization that's carried out by our parents. It is the first and possibly the most important type of socialization. It includes things like learning to walk and talk for the first time. Potty training is a pretty important part of primary socialization, and so is learning to eat food correctly. Primary socialization teaches us to dress appropriately, and very important it teaches us to restrain our antisocial impulses. Toddlers have tantrums, but their parents train them out of this sort of behaviour. In many cases, first learning to read and write happens because of primary socialisation, although that can be secondary socialisation too, as we'll see. An interesting one is religious traditions, which are often passed on by parents to their children, so that also is primary socialisation. Many people think that primary socialization is this essential building block. It establishes the core of who we are if it's done properly. And from this comes our gender roles, our personality, our morality, and our values. That's assuming it's done properly. There's concern that if primary socialization isn't done right, then children can grow up to be wild, uncontrollable delinquents. However, there is another type of socialization, which is secondary socialization. And this is the later influence of other people on our developing norms and values. I say later, we're really perhaps talking about ages 4, 5, 6, when you start going to nursery or begin primary school. And of course, teachers are going to be very important people for this secondary socialization, giving us a more developed sense of how to behave and how we'll be punished if we don't behave. As well as teachers, there are youth leaders, and religious membership is a form of secondary socialization as well. When people start their first jobs, like a paper round, that's secondary socialization, training them to be on time and be responsible and start keeping track of money. A very interesting form of secondary socialization comes from your peer group, your friends. These people are a huge influence on you, both because you want to imitate what they do, but also because they have all sorts of ways of punishing you if you don't behave in ways that they like. And there has always been concern about the media as a force for secondary socialization, whether it's giving people good and positive values, or whether it's putting very destructive thoughts into growing children's heads. There is another type of socialization that's not mentioned in the OCR specification, but it's useful for you to know about, and this is tertiary socialization. Tertiary means third. It's sometimes called resocialization, and this is what happens to adults when they move into new roles. For example, in your career, you may experience discipline from your boss, and you may be instructed in new norms and values for the workplace. Some careers, like the army, have to go through a period of basic training, putting new norms and values into the recruits. Later on in life, social workers might get involved with you if you've run into difficulties, and they'll be trying to socialise you back into being a healthy and successful member of society. And then in old age, you might find yourself living in a retirement home, and the carers there will be socialising you into being a helpful and cooperative citizen. Who are the key scholars that investigate socialisation? We've already met them before. Here's Talcott Parsons, the influential American functionalist from the 1950s. Parsons has a lot to say about the nuclear family. He thinks it is ideal for socializing children because the two parents can give a small number of children the maximum time and attention. But he also thinks it's very important for re-socializing adults. It gives them responsibilities, so it keeps them grounded and emotionally healthy. Parsons believes there is an instrumental role that socialization trains into men to go out into the world and work hard and deal with conflict, and an expressive role that socialization trains into women to be nurturing and caring and emotional. Parsons describes families as personality factories. The family is the place where your essential personality is forged in those early years of childhood through socialization. However, Parsons recognizes that families pass on particularistic values. In other words, the very specific attitudes and priorities that family has, their way of doing things. It's particularly important for children, if they're going to enter wider society, to acquire universalistic values. These are the values that society as a whole needs them to have, and they might not quite be the same as the way your parents do things. You acquire your universalistic values from school, for example, to respect authority, to tolerate differences, and to appreciate the viewpoints of strangers. We've also looked at Margaret Mead, the pioneering American anthropologist who carried out detailed field studies in Papua New Guinea and Samoa in the 1920s. We can look here at her 1935 book, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, and you'll remember there were the three tribes that Mead looked at: the Arapesh, who were gentle and cooperative, the Mundugumor, who were violent and aggressive, and the Chambuli, whose gender roles were the reverse of the traditional roles that Mead expected coming from America. This is quite strong evidence for the power of socialization to make people grow up with very different norms and values. That's a social constructivist view, which we'll look at shortly. How can we evaluate socialization? The sociological perspectives are really helpful for evaluating ideas like this. Let's look at functionalism. Functionalism has a very positive view of socialization. It sees it as transmitting culture from one generation to the next, and this creates social solidarity, a sense of belonging and togetherness, which functionalists think is vital. We've got an image there of a key being passed on from the older generation to the younger generation. This is a great symbol for how functionalists think society works. Socialization also stabilizes people's personalities, and that helps stave off the dreaded anomie, this destructive sense of meaninglessness that can overcome people if they don't feel attached to society. Because without proper socialization, we become confused and unhappy, we might be drawn into criminal pastimes, we become self-destructive. So socialization for functionalists is a source of social order, which they think is really good for us. Of course, this is a very optimistic view of socialization. And we've got to point out that people can be socialized into some pretty nasty norms and values as well. Socialization is the source of a great deal of bigotry. People aren't born as bigots, they learn bigotry, and they very often learn it from their parents. And there are harmful traditions that get passed on through socialization too. We've got a picture there of the Hitler Youth, which was an organisation formed to pass on Nazi values to the next generation. Marxists, then, are much more critical of socialisation. They see it as a source of ruling class ideology. And opposing the ideas of Talcott Parsons, you've got the thought of Eli Zaretsky, 1976. Zaretsky agrees with Parsons that the family socialises children, but not for the benefit of the children themselves. No, the family does this for the benefit of capitalist bosses. The sons are socialised into imitating their father's unquestioning obedience and going to work every day for the ruling class, and the daughters imitate their mothers by helping their future husband become a good worker, and this keeps capitalism going. Feminists take a similar view, that socialisation is the source of a lot of patriarchal ideology. Anne Oakley famously pointed out that girls and boys are socialised differently. Boys are given freedom, they're encouraged to be assertive, whereas girls are controlled and encouraged to be very compliant, biddable, obedient, and to focus on attractiveness. This leads to a debate that's raging in society at the moment about the role of social construction or biology. Can you socialise children to have any norms and values? Or are there limits imposed by biology? For example, gender roles. Could you raise a young child to be feminine or masculine, or does their biological sex make a difference to how they turn out? Functionalists tend to oppose social constructivism. They argue that biology matters, and that means that some socialization works better than others. You are fighting an uphill battle if you want to raise your sons to play with dolls and focus on personal beauty, and your daughters to be aggressive and assertive, they would say. Many parents today, however, are experimenting with different ways of raising their children, including gender-neutral ways. There's also the issue of free will. Socialization seems to say that everything about who we grow up to be is decided for us by the socialization process. And a lot of people do turn out just as their parents or their teachers want them to. But there are many people who don't, and seem to be able to resist the socialization process. We'll look at a different view on how identity is formed when we study interactionism a bit later in the course. Let's look at the exam questions that could come up. Question 1 is the short 6 marker, and you could be asked to explain, using examples, the concept of either primary socialization or secondary socialization. Make sure you have plenty of examples to offer, including a comment on how things like school or peer groups or religion help shape your personality and prepare you to live in society. Question 2 will give you a picture to comment on and a short paragraph of writing to read and quote from. You might get a question such as, using sources A and B and your wider sociological knowledge, explain the concept of primary socialization, or explain the concept of secondary socialization. You won't get a question on explaining the concept of tertiary socialization. Make sure you say what you see in the picture. For example, here we have a child sat on a naughty step being punished for bad behaviour, and this is socialising the child into having norms like politeness and values such as believing it's wrong to throw tantrums and be rude to people. Source B expresses a similar idea that if parents don't socialise their children properly, they will grow up to be dangerous thugs. This is a common attitude of people who believe that socialisation matters and it has to be done right. Question number 3 is the essay question worth 20 marks, and this is the question that invites you to briefly evaluate as well as outline a view. Here we have the view that primary socialisation is the most important factor in how people develop, and the view that secondary socialisation is more important than parenting. In each of these essays you will try and argue 3 different positions. Perhaps that primary socialisation coming from your parents is the most important, and you can have some examples of how parenting shapes us for the rest of our life. Or that secondary socialisation, such as what happens to us in school, is more important, and you could talk about universalistic values. Or even the view that socialisation in fact serves the purposes of ruling class ideology or patriarchal ideology, and therefore is part of a wider force in society that determines how people turn out and where their norms and values come from. I hope that's been a helpful overview of socialisation. You can find out more on this topic from my study guide, Socialisation, Culture and Identity, or the combined study guide with Youth Subcultures. They're both available from Amazon. You can find the link in the description below. Sociology Robot.